So in this segment, we're going to be talking about why the UK is suffering more than other countries, and we know the reason. I've read this article by Faisal Islam, who's someone I have a lot of respect for. My uncle wants me to kind of emulate him in a sense. But I read this article and I got kind of frustrated by it, and I'll talk to you why at the end. But he says, up until now, it's been difficult to pick out the difference between the UK's economic numbers and those across Europe and the rest of the world. I don't think it's been that difficult, to be honest. When you look at the trends in trade, we're not doing that great. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been the overwhelming driver of high inflation and slower growth for most of the European countries. And I think it's important to differentiate which ones you're talking about here, because the Baltic countries have been hit with massive inflation, which we'll talk about in a moment. I think it's because they're more trade reliant on Ukraine and Russia, which makes sense because of their geography. In recent days, the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey has warned inflation is set to be higher for longer in the UK and growth in the economy is weaker too. And that's something I covered in a Bloomberg article a few weeks ago, I think, or recently. These gloomy forecasts echoed made by the International Monetary Fund and the Organisation of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And those are, I didn't cover the IMF stuff, but I covered the OECD stuff. But Bailey told a central bank forum that the UK is probably weakening rather earlier and somewhat more than others. He said, I think that's been somewhat evident for a few months now, and yet you do very little about it apart from raise interest rates, which in my opinion is not the right thing to do. He would expect more persistence in the headline rate because the UK's energy price cap system, this suppressed inflation in the year but raised it earlier on, and we'll talk about why I think that's baloney. Retailers too have said they've started to expect different outcomes for the UK versus the rest of Europe. The boss of the owner of Boots, Stefano Pessina, said he suspected the UK will have a big recession, probably bigger than other European countries. And you need to ask yourself, why is that the case? He does list some possible things out here in the article, but what's different for the UK versus the rest of the world? What has the UK done recently that no other country has actually done? Last month, Pepco, which owns Poundland, said its results that in the UK customers were scaling back even on essential purchases, and that's where you can really see an economy in the decline, when you can see things like people not buying the essential goods because that means they can't afford it, which creates further economic decline. Whereas elsewhere in Europe, where wage rises are making up for the price rises, this was not the case in the UK. Now, I don't know if it's the government pushing up wage increases. That could be the case. What I would say is that with more direct support from other countries to their citizens, in the Netherlands and Ireland, for example, I think they've given out far more than the UK government has, and it's been more targeted as well. The UK's response to all this is a joke, especially considering that I think energy in the UK is higher than a lot of other countries. I think Italy is higher than ours, but I think a lot of other European countries have lower energy costs than we do. What's driving this? On inflation, Bailey pointed to the structure of the price gap affecting the timing of the peaks, which again, I'm going to look at and try and debunk as best I can in a few moments. Sterling has fallen markedly against the dollar. That's a Brexit consequence. No one can tell me otherwise, especially when you look at how it dipped from 2016 and hasn't kind of gone over those 16 figures, adding to inflationary pressure for imported fuel and energy. And we import a lot of fuel and energy, but more importantly, we import a lot of food. And the price of food has gone up directly because of the drop in the pound. The key measures for UK trade performance, the current account reached its worst levels in record in the first quarter, and that's something you can't blame on the pandemic. You really can't, because we're supposedly out of it, and other European countries are going back to pre-pandemic levels for their economies. The UK is an outlier, so you have to look at why is the UK an outlier in that respect. Measures of core goods inflation, stripping out volatile measures such as inflation and food in the UK are higher than the US and markedly higher than the Eurozone, despite the fact that food is one of those things that have gone up dramatically because of Brexit. You're looking at potentially 20% in food inflation. Some of that's fueled by the fact that farms can't get staff to pick the food from the ground. So what that means is we have to import more. With a weakened pound, that makes it more difficult and more expensive to import more. Plus the fact that everything we import comes with customs fees and checks, etc. That further increases the price to export to the UK. And if you work in logistics, and this is something that Faisal Islam hasn't talked about in this article, which is really frustrating, any of these points about things like customs, etc. But he talks about trade barriers, which is very nebulous. But if you work in logistics, for example, if you're trying to export something to the UK from the EU, right, it all goes through customs agents, you got customs fees, etc., all of that stuff, right? But then you still have to get the lorry out of the UK, and if you're trying to export something out of the UK, whether it be agri-food goods or manufactured goods or whatever, those go through the full rigmarole of checks on the EU side. You're talking rules of origins, you're talking vet checks, potentially customs fees, everything, the full shebang. And that further pushes up prices for logistic companies and lorry drivers. Everything goes up in price because of the UK deciding to Brexit. The Brexit factor at play. The obvious question posed to Bailey was about a Brexit factor here. Economists predicted that Brexit would make the trade-off between inflation and growth more difficult. The UK's growth is very low and our inflation is very high, both because of trade barriers and labour shortages. And the trade barriers are created directly by Brexit, and the labour shortages are in part created by Brexit because we have less access to a very skilled labour market that exists within the EU. If forecasts of the UK underperformance turn out to be true, then this would be consistent with a Brexit factor at play, because as we come out of the pandemic, I don't know when the Russian invasion of Ukraine will end. I'm hoping soon, very much hoping soon, and that's when we can finally get peace in Ukraine. We can get a lot more global stability, but even when that happens, the UK will still be an outlier. He talks about a smaller pool of workers should mean the UK labour market is now less flexible, so that creates its own problems because you have to pay people more, but also the fact that you can't fill up the spaces you have, which makes you less able to kind of, the output that you would have if you had the labour force, if that makes sense. If you need 10 workers and you only have 7, you're going to struggle to manufacture or do the things you need to do. If you work in farms, for example, you won't be able to pick out the food from the ground, which is something that farmers have continuously talked about. The British Chamber of Commerce implored the government to review urgently its shortage occupation list as hotels and restaurants turned away clients amid shortages. And that's just more of an indication of kind of the shortages we're facing. It's skilled and, quote, lower skilled, even though we know working in customer service is one of the most difficult things a human being will ever have to suffer in the developed world because people suck. But point being is this all creates further problems down the line with productivity, for example. He hasn't actually mentioned, what annoys me is he hasn't mentioned the specific kind of things with trade barriers and labour shortages, which is very frustrating, but I think they have word limits on these articles. His post-pandemic challenges. Another mechanism identified by policymakers is that within the UK, firms see less competition from Europe and increasing margins, therefore prices. So essentially, this is profiteering and price gouging by British businesses because they are, selling the products for more money and making more of a profit. Some of these businesses will be suffering from the energy cost increases as well as the fuel cost increases, but they are, by the sounds of it, gouging us. And that's why you have to do a lot more windfall taxes. We saw recently I think it was the CEO of Sainsbury's got a massive pay rise or a bonus, and he refused to give a living wage to his workers. What are the workers supposed to do in that situation? They can strike, but this is where the government has to step in and say, look, you've made a lot of money here this year, and that's not because of your own ingenuity, it's because you're price gouging people. We're going to windfall tax you. The more profit you make, the higher the tax is going to be. That's what the government have to do now, but they're not doing it. The Eurozone itself is under internal pressure again, with risks of a re-emergence of the dormant crisis a decade ago, the Eurozone crisis, which was really bad. I was kind of just growing up and not really understanding it. The structure of the energy cap may explain why we have spiked now rather than the rest of Europe, and that's something I'm just bored of that point. So we're going to debunk this now, right? If we look at when the price cap was lifted, right, that was back in April. So you would assume our inflation would have been lower, right, around April this year than other countries. But if you look at it, we've been pretty much level with the Eurozone. Our inflation kind of being higher recently. This is based on the consumer price index as well. And I'm just kind of show you, the more I zoom in, the more you can kind of see it's the same. So the argument that the price cap is the thing that's changed things doesn't make any sense when we're probably in step with Germany based on the consumer price index. Now, I don't know how any of the other central banks have run their inflation figures, but what we do know is that the UK have been playing fast and loose with the inflation figures. That's something Jack Monroe, you kind of dragged the, what was it called, the ONS over, the Office of National Statistics, when she said, your basket of goods is not, it's not indicative of the general country's kind of basket of goods, should I say. I've heard from the great one himself, Fact Not Fiction. He constantly talks about how the UK is being tricky with the inflation figures. These aren't accurate. So the argument that it's the price cap that's been a game changer here, you can see March 2022, you see April, we've been pretty much in step with the Eurozone here, and the Eurozone, which has had to deal with really bad inflation, because their average is boosted by countries that are really suffering from massive inflation due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you look at a country like Latvia, it's almost at 17%, consumer price index inflation. That adds into the Eurozone average. So, for anyone to claim that the UK kind of peaked later than Europe is ridiculous, especially given the fact that the Eurozone average is really, really badly hampered by the fact that Russia's invaded Ukraine, and a lot of those European countries are far more reliant on trade with Russia for things like fuel. Germany's really struggling of weaning itself off of Russian gas, essentially, Russian fuel sources. So this point that Faisal Islam makes, or the central banker makes, is ridiculous. Genuinely, the structure of the price cap may explain why we have spiked now. It's not the case. And once that cap gets lifted again, it's going to be even worse. I've seen Martin Lewis speak about it. Bills are going to go up, I think, minimum £70 up to a few hundred a month. He goes, but if over the coming year these inflation numbers stay high for longer here in the UK than the rest of the advanced European and world economies, the shadow of post-Brexit policy changes only really affecting the country will loom large. But he's saying, if once the war in Ukraine ends, etc., that and we get some more stability, that will we be able to see Brexit's impact on our inflation. But the simple fact is, you can see it now. Food inflation's gone up. Food prices have gone up by 20%. That's what farmers have put it at. Come on, bro. I know you can do better than this. I know you can do better than this article. This is garbage. This is actual garbage. What you've written here does not stack up against what the figures are showing on the FT's chart. Bro, come on, man. Genuine. This is where my frustration for journalists come in. Fair enough. If I'm wrong, I'll take an L on it. I'll take an L. I'll be happy to take one, because I'd rather I be wrong than him be wrong. Because a lot more people will read his work and see his work than they will see mine. But, you can see here, he's kind of gone off what Andrew Bailey's talked about and said, well, maybe when the world goes back to normal, we can really see the Brexit impact. When people have done the economic modelling, they put the figure at 5.1% of our GDP. Fair enough, it's not going to be the most accurate number in the world, but it gives you a ballpark figure of where you can start from. We know what's impacting us. We know the imports are going up, and it's not just because of the fuel costs. We know we're being price gouged, and that's something the government can stop, or at least try and prevent. But when it comes to Brexit, at least we know that you can add in the costs of the labour shortages here. That's caused by Brexit. We know that. You can add in the costs of the customs fees. We know that. And you can add in the cost of increased logistics with the shortage of lorry drivers, and also them getting stuck at the border. Because I don't doubt, very soon, if they haven't done so by now, they will be charging, logistics companies and drivers will be charging more money to come to the UK, because they can be stuck at that border for days. And if you're not asking for money, you really should be. You really should be. But anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.